All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first virtual live version of NeBytes, and hope everybody's doing okay out there. We were going to do this session in mid-March, but then with the coronavirus, we've had to postpone it a little while and do our very first virtual one as our March/April version. So we've got a lot of other talks coming up as well. We've got one in mid-April and maybe one to follow shortly after that as well. So please keep an eye on the Tito event site and Twitter, and keep an eye out for emails and such like coming around as well. Okay, so our very first speaker is one that probably doesn't need much introduction from me, because Peter Shorty has been at NeBytes 3-4 times, something like that. Always does great talks, and always, it's around .NET and C# and stuff like that. And tonight he's going to be talking about Blazor, practicalities of Blazor, rather than just an introduction to it. So if you don't know what that is, I'm sure he'll explain. But that's what we're all sort of looking forward to tonight. During the session, you can ask questions on the right-hand side of the screen. There's a section for asking questions and chatting and stuff like that. I'll be monitoring that, and any questions that come up, I'll be putting them to Peter over Skype. Okay, so we'll be going from now till about 8:30, and then we'll kind of wrap things up about 8:30, something like that. So, housekeeping out of the way, I will hand you over to Peter.
Thank you very much. Now, hopefully, everybody can hear me. Just give me a second while I disconnect this call and rearrange things on my desktop here. I'm sure, Derek, you will let me know if anything's not working or anything like that. Right, where are we? So you're staring at a blank wallpaper at the moment, so where's my slides at? There they are. Right, practical Blazor. A few slides, mostly code, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Right, oh, okay, sorry. Right, I'll try not to get sidetracked by the display I've got to my right. If you find me looking to the right, then please do feel free to shout at me. Okay. Right, session overview. So, not many slides. I'm going to have a brief little talk with you about Blazor server-side versus Blazor WebAssembly and the programming model in general. Largely because Blazor is a UI toolkit, I'm going to focus more on putting layouts together and compostable component architecture, and a little bit on component communication. I'll wrap that up with a couple of server-side gotchas. I was going to do a bit on JavaScript interrupt as well, but because this is server-side, it's not so easy to demo. Instead, what I'm going to do, if we get through all the bits that are on this session overview before 8:30, I'm going to show you an application that I've already written. Unfortunately, I can't actually share the application with you, but I will talk you through some of the aspects of it, because it does show some of the other bits and pieces that I won't have time to demonstrate in the live code session. As Derek has said, I don't really need to introduce myself very much. There's my contact info if you wish to contact me. And I'm not difficult to find on the interwebs. Come and look up Lidnug, look for my GitHub, just find me on Twitter in general. As Derek mentioned, there is a chat box to the right of the live stream. If you want to join in the chat, you will have to be signed into YouTube with a YouTube and Google account. Now, that's good, but please I do ask, there is only 200 slots. So if all you're going to do is watch and you're not actually going to ask anything, then please log out, and that leaves slots free for those people who do want to ask questions and who do want to participate in the chat. Graham, NeBytes will be relaying questions to me via IM, and he'll generally be moderating. So if you've got any problems, ask him, and then he'll bring me in as we need to. If you want to join in and you want the code, it's going to be on my GitHub page in the project called Practical Blazor. Now what I've done is I've put the project together in different check-ins. So I'm going to wind it back to my first check-in, and then I'm going to go through the project a check-in at a time using Git's history features to navigate the code. If you want to work along with me, you're more than welcome to, but what you'll need to do is you'll need to clone a copy of the code, and then you'll need to have it set up on your own machine in Visual Studio, and you'll need to use the Visual Studio history manipulator to forward and back as with the different commits in the project. Right, so without further ado, let's kick off with a little bit on Blazor server versus WebAssembly. Now, as you should all know by now, Blazor is coming in two different formats. There is Blazor server and the Blazor WebAssembly client. Now, the WebAssembly client will run entirely in the browser, and server, as the name suggests, will work on the server using a more traditional ASP.NET format. The project setups with your startup class, your program class, as you'll see shortly, are all entirely the same. I was going to have a WebAssembly project set up and run alongside this, the server one that I'm working on, but I only did an update a couple of days ago, and as I've remembered after I did the update, when you do an update on the preview track, you have to reinstall the various templates and the NuGet libraries and things, and I haven't done that yet with mine. So as a result, I can make a Blazor client app, but only if I use the .NET command line. I don't really want to do that because I want to keep everything in Visual Studio here at the moment. So we're just going to focus on the server side. Now, sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. Right, the biggest difference that you're going to have with Blazor server side versus the WebAssembly stuff is that you cannot do everything in WebAssembly that you can in a Blazor server app. Now, Blazor server app, obviously because it's running on the server, it has access to the server file system, it has access to any applications that are on there. You may have back channels to the end user's machine, direct access to databases, things like that. The WebAssembly version of Blazor is still restricted by the browser. So just because you're running C# code in the browser, you cannot all of a sudden get access to the user's file system on the hard drive, or access pictures in their My Documents or anything like that. You're still restricted by the same security model. The other thing is, with WebAssembly on the client side, you are going to need JavaScript. Now, the browser has various APIs in, Web Bluetooth, Geo for GPS, OpenGL, Canvas, Sound, all sorts of things like that. You're still going to need to use JavaScript in order to access those. Whereas with the server side, you typically, if you're going to produce sound, for example, you're typically going to produce it using server-side libraries. Then you're going to push it into something like an audio tag that's already pre-rendered in the page. Data retrieval and comms as well. With the Blazor server side, you have direct access to everything in your app. I allude to that a bit later on. Whereas with the server side, it's a traditional HTTP stroke WebSocket kind of communication. So there's no large JSON packets with server side. Well, there is, depending on how you write it. And that's kind of one of the good things about Blazor server side as well. Blazor server side, because things are running on the server and everything goes across a simple WebSocket in an encrypted manner, there is none of these large packets of data that go over a REST interface. There's none of your DLLs for your application are getting delivered to the browser either. The only thing that gets delivered to the browser is a simple index page, then a WebSocket is set up, and then updates for the UI are done over the WebSocket. So there's no DLLs delivered to the browser, which makes your app a little bit more secure. What you kind of get with Blazor server is a very, very good mixture of very, very fast, very, very fluid UI updates, which are in a lot of ways similar to using a front-end framework such as Angular or Aurelia, my personal favourite. But you get the security of a back-end server model such as classic ASP.NET, ASP.NET MVC, and other libraries like that. One of the best things about the WebAssembly model, however, is the use of various classes. Any of you who have been playing around with .NET Core will know that it now has a built-in dependency injection system. And the good thing with the dependency injection system is that you can have things as singletons, and you can have things as transients and other types of objects. Now, with singletons in the browser, because it's a singleton per browser, you can actually store state in the singleton in the browser. If you have a login, for example, you can store the username and all the user information in the browser, in that object, just as you might store it in a class or a POCO within a normal general desktop application. Now, that means that unlike the server side, you can easily maintain state and without it interfering with any other state anywhere else. With the server side, obviously you have the problems of a singleton in a server application. If you change something in the singleton that's on the server, that singleton is then changed for every user of the service. I was going to do a whiteboard in all this, but unless we really need to, I don't think I will. I may come back to that later. But for now, let's get rid of the slides there, and let's flip to Visual Studio. Let's just take my history back to the beginning. And all of a sudden I cannot remember. Yes, there we go, revert to that. Yeah. Now, just a little side note, if you're doing this kind of commit traversing with Visual Studio, one thing you'll probably find that you have to do is unload the project and reload it. So we're just going to do that, and then we'll reload that in, and that'll bring everything up to date. It's a Visual Studio thing, not a .NET thing. Right, so creating a Blazor application is easy. I'm not actually going to go through and commit to creating one, but it's exactly the same as creating any other project or solution. You go in project solution, test Blazor. No, I don't want to open it. Did I click on? Yes, I did, didn't I? You muppet shorty. Right, let's try that again. So we're going to create a new project. You'll see here that we have a Blazor app. Now, until the WebAssembly in the client version becomes production ready, the only option you have at the moment is a Blazor app. And this will always create you a server-side one. If we go into create, and then obviously you'll get the different settings and that you're used to, so you can pick which version of the runtime you want to work with. You can see that I have the client side WebAssembly version under .NET Core 3, but I don't have it in my 3.1 build. You can configure for HTTPS, Docker, all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to create this because this will create what I've already got loaded into my browser. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I don't have any authentication switched on, and I don't have mine configured for HTTPS. So, what do you get when you create a new... Okay, what's happened there? I didn't expect it to unload that. Thank you, Visual Studio. Now, can we just try doing what it is I wanted to do? Thank you very much. Right, where are we? And that's not the revision that I want. Trust Visual Studio to muck things up. So just bear with me a moment, please. No, I don't. Oh, dang it. Dang it. Right. View history. Right. Has this given me what I want it to give me? No, it bloody well hasn't. Right. Okay, sorry about this, folks. When you start out, what you will get is you will get a very, very empty application. There won't be anything of what I've already got in here. You will get a pages, you will get a shared folder, you'll get a WW root, and you'll get the obligatory program and startup classes. Now, this is by design because Blazor server-side is, like everything else in the new .NET Core way of doing things, an identical programming model with the startup and the program and the dependency injector container and all that lovely stuff. Now, reset and delete changes. Yep. So is that going to reset to where I wanted it? Yes, it has. Okay, fantastic. So, completely from scratch, we have good old generic startup class. You can see that everything's how you might expect it for a standard command line. What you will see is that you will see in the configure part here, you've got this map Blazor hub, and then you've got fallback page. Now the fallback to page is basically if you try to go to a route that you don't have a page for or you don't have a route for in your Blazor server application, then it'll fall back to the host, and the host is your application and its home page as it would appear at startup. Blazor server-side applications are fairly straightforward. You start out with an index page, which is just, as you see, we'll come back to that in a minute with the page directive and everything. And you have a few other bits and pieces here, and you'll notice that it all looks very, very Razor page-like. Now, again, this is by design, and that's because Blazor, server-side and WebAssembly, works on the same sort of model as ASP.NET Razor pages. In fact, if you look around on the web, and if you look at Chris Sainty's blog particularly, there's a good article on there on how to use Blazor components in an existing MVC application. So it is wholly possible to have a traditional MVC application where you have separate pages being browsed from URL to URL to URL, and in effect have individual Blazor components in a box within that page, acting, if you like, as miniature little SPAs, but without them having to be in an iframe. Now, I'm not going to demo that here because it takes a bit of setting up, and I've not set things up to do that. So going back to the startup class, you'll see that everything else is pretty normal. Use routing, use static files, use the exception handler if you're in development mode. You can see that in the configure services, we add Razor pages, we add server-side Blazor, and you can see there that the startup demo that you get also has a singleton for a weather forecast service, and just the normal stuff. Now, if we run this, you'll have seen this demo a million times before, especially if you've watched any of Steve Sanderson's NDC demos. But I'm just going to rack it up anyway. So we get the standard home page, we get the counter page. You can see that the updates are instant. Move between them. You can see that the data and all that comes. And honestly, it's nothing particularly special. Right. Now, just like ASP.NET MVC and other Razor page based development environments, you have a shared folder and you have things like the imports file and the layout file. Layouts are produced by creating a standard Razor component but inheriting it from the layout component base. A layout file is very much like an ASP.NET master page. So if you're used to master pages from web forms, you'll be right at home using main layouts in Razor. Everything comes set up with a standard main layout already. You can see there we've got our little sidebar, and you can see we've got the nav menu that we had down the left hand side of the screen. That nav menu is defined in the nav menu component here. If we open that, you'll see that that is just standard HTML with a bit of code at the bottom. We'll come back to this in more detail shortly. And it's all very standard code. If you're used to working with normal HTML and JavaScript, then working with Blazor, even server side on the server itself, is not going to feel very, very different. Pages are in the pages folder. So as I pointed out before, when you start up, your index page, your index.razor page is the first page. When I mentioned the fallback, there's the fallback for your host. So in here, for example, you can see that this is actually your index page. So if you're going to pull in, say, external CSS, external JavaScript, things like that, this is where you add them into this page. This is where your headers are, And this is the HTML that gets delivered to the browser to kick everything off. The JavaScript file that's loaded here loads the Blazor server WebSocket in, and it sets up the communication with the server side to feed the updates to and from the UI that is at that point running in the browser. Component type of app, so that is your actual app. And if you note here, we have app as a type, and down here we have app Razor. So if I open app Razor, you'll see that this is where your main router is. So your page router is controlled here. Your not found section here. So if a page is put in that is not routable, or, well, not necessarily routable, if a page is put in that's not found, but Blazor can handle it, then Blazor will display that for you. If you try to route to a full page and a full URL and Blazor can't handle it, then it will fall back to that host page and basically reload your application for you. Pages are pushed into the main layout using app body in exactly the same way as they are with ASP.NET MVC. Again, this is the Razor programming model at work. And the body comes from the pages in the pages folder. So if we open up index.razor, for example, you'll see that at the top of each of these pages we have an at page and a page root. If we open fetch data, for example, we'll see we have root fetch data. The counter page has root counter, and it's this attribute at the top of the file that defines what fragment and URL this page responds to once it's running in the browser and once the app is up and it's kick-started. Couple of things to note here. All must be prefixed with a slash. Yeah. So if I take that out, for example, and there you go, you'll see that I've got a red squiggly. The error that it gives me, it must begin with a slash character. So there's no relative routing, unfortunately. I can't say, for example, do counter foobar, for example. It won't allow me to. But if I put a root fragment on there, then it will allow me to do that. Yep. So page URLs must have the preceding / on them. Everything works from the root of the application. Excuse me. You'll notice also you have a www root folder. So the www root folder is exactly the same again as the www root folder in an ASP.NET MVC app, in a JavaScript client app, and CSS. You can add JavaScript folders in here and put JavaScript in them. You can add images folders. Anything you add into there will be accessible using normal JavaScript techniques. So if I was to put an image folder in there and put an image into it, I could then say go image source equals images foo.png, and that would work exactly as you expect it to. If we go back to host.cshtml for a moment, you will see that that's used in here. So there's our CSS site.css. So you get a basic site CSS, and the template that's built into Visual Studio when you build a new application also comes with Bootstrap and OpenIconic for icons already built in. So immediately, straight away, you can start creating code that that has bootstrap icons, bootstrap styles, and divs and boxes and rows and columns and all that lot in. And you can start using Flexbox because of the new Flexbox styles that are built into Bootstrap. Dependencies, I'll not cover that. It's exactly the same. You go in there for your NuGet stuff. Because this is running on the server, because it's .NET Core, any NuGet package that conforms to .NET Standard 2 alongside .NET Core 3.1 can be used with this. The same is also true for the WebAssembly stuff as well. The WebAssembly client can use .NET Standard 2 NuGet packages. You do have to be careful what packages you choose from NuGet in the WebAssembly version of the client, simply because of the aforementioned browser sandbox. There are things like the file system and all that. So if you pick a NuGet package that tries to access the file system or tries to do something that ordinarily wouldn't be allowed in the browser, then you're going to run afoul of it. But if the package you're putting in works entirely in C#, for example, a class that does hash keys or does random passwords or something like that, then it'll all work perfectly fine without a problem. Right. Now, let's just undo all these changes. Otherwise, I won't be able to do anything with my history. Now, we're going to move on, and we're going to go back and take a closer look at layouts. As I mentioned just a moment ago, the main thing about Blazor is it's a composable UI. So you have your layouts, and you have the idea is that you break everything down into chunks. Now, you might not always want to have every page using the same layout. So if we reset to here, just give that a second. Yep, there we go. What you will see is I've now added a second layout here. Now, I've not done anything special with this. Basically, I've stripped out the menu and just made it into a full width layout container, and I've set it to an azure background colour. But you'll see that all I've done is I've created a razor component. You can tell by the fact that it's got .razor after it, and I've inherited it from the layout component base. And then what I've done here is I've changed it in one page and one page only. So if I go to fetch data, you will see that preceding the page URL, I've got an @layout, and I've gave that a different name for the layout to use. Layouts are controlled by your imports and your app, I think it is. Let me just double check that. Yes, so your app razor specifies your default layout here. Right? So if I wanted my new full screen layout to be the default layout for every page in my site, I simply just need to change that type name there to full screen layout. Likewise with the not found part, I can give that an entirely different layout if I want there. So I could make that a nice full screen 404 message or anything like that. Use your imagination. What I can also do is on a page by page basis is I can set the layout individually. So if we run this now, what you should see, wouldn't think this was on an SSD, would you? There we go. So what you'll find now, you see everything uses the same layout as is expected until I go to fetch data. And you can see that fetch data now has its own look and feel. Yep. Doesn't Doesn't matter how many times I go back and forth, fetch data will always be using that page, because I've told it to specifically use that layout and that layout only. Now, the astute of you at this point might be thinking, well, that's all great. I like the fact that I can use separate layouts, but that actually means that, well, it kind of looks like if I want to use separate layouts, I'm going to have to alter every page separately. No, because you got your back covered there as well. What we can actually do is we can actually make use of these imports.razor files. Right? Now, imports.razor is quite important. What imports.razor allows you to do is it allows you to have a global set of using statements. And this is even something that normal C# can't do. Well, not unless you start creating abstracted or inherited classes anyway. What imports.razor allows you to do is it allows you to say, right, I'm going to use this library, this library, this library, this library, and put them all there, and they will then just magically become available in anything that is underneath that imports. And since this particular import is at the root of the project, this will cover every folder below it. Import files are locally scoped. So let's just skip forward and reset to our next point. And as you will see, a folder called diff layout has appeared. Now in diff layout, I've put an imports razor, and it's largely the same as the imports razor that is in the root of the project, but there's one small difference, and that is I've put the layout for my new nice posh full screen layout onto the end of it. What this then will do, if we look in the fetch data razor view that's in the diff layout folder, you will see there is no layout mentioned in here now, just a root for that page, and that page will, as it did previously, use that layout. Any page that gets added to that diff layout folder from this point onwards will use that layout without any modifications. So going back to running the application now, we have our home, we have our counter, we have our fetch data. I've put that back to how the original version was. And if we now change that to diff layout, you will see, just as expected, it uses our other layout page. Now, this is, if any of you have previously used areas in ASP.NET MVC in order to divide your application up into separate chunks so that you can get different designs and different layouts for different sections of your site. This is kind of like that, but is very, very, very much easier, because now you don't have to go setting up areas and setting up daft user namespaces, things like that. You simply just have to create folders. You can create your entire folder hierarchy in your pages. So you can have pages admin, pages users, pages batten down the hatches, whatever the heck you like. And you can have a separate imports file in each of those folders. And then the very nature of just putting the page that you want to appear under a layout in a specific folder gives it that look and feel. Perfectly simple. And of course, at the end of the day, shared stuff can always still go in shared, and you could even put an imports in your shared folder, so that anything that was shared used its own imports folder as well. For the win, I'd recommend not doing that because it does cause things to go a little bit screwy. I've found out through experience. But that's largely layouts. Now, you can also nest layouts. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. But if we go back to the documentation here. Incidentally, if you're looking for ASP, if you're looking for Blazor documentation, this is where you need to be here. You need to be in the ASP.NET Core Blazor Microsoft Docs. And honestly, guys, the docs are really, really good. Microsoft has actually rolled out the red carpet on this. The docs are really easy to read. Any of you who remember what MSDN used to be like will know exactly what I'm on about here. These are streets ahead, and they don't read like Klingon or anything like that. They are written in a very English, very easy to understand way. Right, anyway, nested layouts. If we scroll down here, you can nest layouts as well. I don't have an example of it in this code, but you can, for example, have a layout in a master component, then you can have a layout in a component under that master component, and you can have body tags in each of those layouts as well. So you can break your page design right down. You can have a larger outer page that has, say, a side menu. Then you can have maybe a small inner part on one page that is the user manager, and then on another page inside the main layout you could maybe have a password manager or a machine manager or whatever it is your application does. And then in each of those components you can break those components down, and the components can even have their own layouts with their own app body, so that you can provide just the smallest, most minimal amount of markup from the actual page routes that you need to. Yeah, so you can boilerplate right the way down to a very, very small component if that's what you need to do. However, as you'll see shortly, we'll actually go back to looking at components themselves. But it's worth looking at what you can do with the layouts before you go any further. I mean, for example, you can see there we've got the header, the nav, the body, and that's largely a whole page, and then the nav is nested in that, and then the body's nested in that. And it can get very, very complicated very, very fast if you nest it too much, but it's also very, very useful to really, really break your UI up. Right. So we'll leave layouts there at the moment, and we'll start examining components. Now, before I actually move on in the code that's in the repository, you've already seen a good example of how components are used with the nav menu that you get by default. In fact, even in index, you'll see here we have this survey prompt title, and you'll notice as well that it appears in purple. Those of you who've used ASP.NET web helpers, I never remember the terminology, but those of you who've used those sort of web helper style partial things that come in the newer versions of ASP.NET MVC will note that they generally appear in purple as well. And there's actually nothing stopping you, because you can embed Blazor components into a Razor page. There's nothing technically stopping you from embedding a Blazor component in a web helper as well. I can't say I've tried it. I don't know anybody who's actually tried it. I've heard people talk about it. I've not seen it done. But technically, there's nothing stopping you from doing it. If we go back to our original master page, you'll see again we have our nav menu there. and the nav menu is a shared component in here. And well, I've already had this open. It's a bit hard to keep track when that's what you're working from. And again, it's just standard HTML. You can see we have a nav link there. So we're going down, down, down. We get smaller, 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 down to the nth degree. Navlink is actually a component that's built into the Blazor runtime, and it basically creates an anchor tag, but it takes into account things like the page routing. So if you're putting in a link to a page within Blazor or a component within Blazor, then you should use the nav link, because that understands how to match to the different counter and fetch data, the different pages and the routing mechanism that's in Blazor. All of this all works the same in the WebAssembly client as it does in the server client. Again, little surprise there. So let's go ahead and add our own user component. I have noticed that this is behaving itself tonight as well. I'm not having to reload the project, so fingers crossed that the demo gods are going to continue to love me for the rest of this. Now that I've said that, they won't. We all know how this works. Right, now you'll notice that I've built a components folder here. You can put your components in shared if that's what you want to do. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. I prefer to keep my components in separate folders, and my shared folder I usually use for things like larger bits of the UI, like for example the nav menu, headers, footers, banners, things like that. I also use it for overridden components. After we've gone through the material that I've got for this demo, I'm going to show you a project that I've written for my own internal use within my company, which unfortunately I won't be releasing, but you'll be able to see from that where I use the shared folder, because I've created some replacements for some of the validation components that are built into Blazor. Generally, separation is good. It makes things easy to manage. So if I open my user list up, nothing really special. We're largely just repeating ourselves here. There's the user list. Press F5. And it would open it down there, wouldn't it? There we go. And there's our user list. Not unexpected. However, it starts coming into its own when you start realizing that using components and nesting components inside of each other is where you need to be. So we'll start with just filling our component out just a little bit, and we'll make it a little bit more interesting. So you'll see that right now this application is now starting to grow, and it's starting to grow organically, which is not too dissimilar to the way our clients and our managers like us to grow their applications as they come up with new specifications. And you can see I've got a services folder, and I've got my data folder, and I've got a user model in there. Microsoft are heavily investing in the service orientated way of doing things, and this works really, really well with the dependency injection system. So you'll see if I open this up, I've got a very, very simple user service here. Doesn't do anything particularly taxing. I've got some static data there. I've got fetch user, fetch all users. You can imagine, if you like, that this might be an abstract service that connects to a database or to some other web feed or some other source of data, async or not async. It's entirely up to you. You could also, if you were using the WebAssembly client, and this is where things like the singleton approach comes into use, you could in actual fact define that as is, like that, in the WebAssembly client, and then mark it as a singleton, and that data could then be updated and managed and changed and stored and kept within the singleton as though it was a database. In fact, I believe, I haven't used it yet, but I do believe that everybody's favourite little file database, SQLite, has actually been ported to Blazor and or WebAssembly in some form, and that it allows you to store, I think it's up to about 4 or 5 megabytes of data in the SQLite database, and work with it in exactly the same way as you would with a larger database such as Postgres or SQL Server or anything like that. For our purposes, what we've done here is we've developed that service, and as is expected, we've registered it in our startup with the add transient users. I haven't done it as a singleton here, with it being a server-side application. Singletons on the server, as I mentioned earlier, can cause you a lot of problems, and really it's a big no-no. Now, if we go to our user list component, you'll see that we've got our normal HTML markup there. It's a table. It's a very, very simple table. There's nothing particularly clever here. There's nothing particularly challenging. But you'll notice that in the code section, we now have this strange looking thing here with an inject attribute on it. Inject, when used with a variable like that in a ASP.NET Blazor component, injects that particular servicing. So as long as you've got it registered in the dependency injector, just merely put an inject on it like that and setting it up with the appropriate type and the appropriate getters and setters means that it is there, it is injected, and it's all done magically for you. There's none of this having to create the constructor and then put the parameter in the constructor and assign it in the constructor like you do with normal dependency injection practices. You can if you want, by the way. I don't have an example of it in what I'm showing you here tonight, but you can, if you wish, separate this code from this HTML markup in a very, very similar way to the way you used to have markup and back-end code for web forms pages. And you can have them set up as separate classes with various functionality in the class, if that's the way you like doing things. Personally, I actually like having the code in my markup like this because it keeps everything single and self-contained. One of the biggest problems that I had with Angular, and my favourite Aurelia for that matter, is that the code and the CSS and the markup were always in separate files. So if I was changing styles in a component, I would quite often have to go and find the CSS file, make a change, then browse, go back to the component file. The HTML was separate to the JavaScript, and it was just a lot of work to switch between files all the time. Using the @code way of doing things just makes it that much easier. And maintenance, let's be fair, in anything more than a medium-sized app, maintenance can be a bitch if you've got code all over the place. Anything that makes our lives easier is a win for me. Now, you'll also notice that I've used the new .NET Core Lambda returning function here. So I can basically say this is a function, or this is a variable like function, but it looks just like a variable, and I can treat it like a variable, and I can read that variable and interact with that variable in exactly the same way as I might expect a variable, but it's actually a function call. So that means I don't even have to create a function. I could do it the other way if I wanted. I could have a function in here. I could say private list user model, load my users, whatever. But I realistically don't need to do that. So again, it's all about keeping you focused on the layout. It's all about keeping you focused on the UI and not having to venture off and do too much code or do too much boilerplate code. It keeps you focused only on the code that makes your application run and do what it needs to do. So let's just quickly run this. And there we go. Simple table. That's our user list component there. This is our page. And this is our layout. Just as expected. Now, we've built a table here. Okay? Again, boilerplate. Yeah? Yeah, you can style this with Bootstrap, you can make it look nicer, but one of the biggest benefits that Silverlight developers had, and WPF in general, was the control that they had down at an object level for building a UI representation. And that way of working, that feeling, has been pushed forward into Blazor, client and WebAssembly. So rather than boilerplate things like this and have tables and lots of unwieldy content with embedded for each and razor code constructs in it, the idea is that this might be somewhere where you would break it down. So you might have a component that does this and none of this. If we step forward in the history for this, I can show you that happening. So you'll see now that we now have a user entry component, and if I load that user entry component, you'll see we're going back to this everything in a single file. Everything is in one place where it's easy to manage and categorically easy to code fold as well, so that you can get rid of distractions. I've got my styles in there for this component, you know. The jury's still out on which method people in general prefer. I actually like putting my styles that are specific to a component in the component, but I know that some people don't. Some people like to have the style file globally in the system, and you can put these components into a separate DLL, and you can provide that DLL to your user with the style files and the JavaScript files. But that's a topic for another discussion, because after the last major release of Blazor, Microsoft changed a few things around, and instead of things like CSS and JavaScript being loaded automatically from a DLL, they've made it so that you put the burden onto your user, and that your user has to add these CSS into their index files and into their HTML, and it gets a bit messy when you have to put NuGet instructions up on your NuGet page that say, yeah, it's dead simple, do a NuGet, but then you have to add this, and this to this file and that file and the other file. Prior to that, it was automatic. Somebody in the Blazor community, and I was talking to them on GitHub for Blazor the other day, has made a small little NuGet library that you can add to your project that puts that automatic functionality back in. I'm not into. Oh, I did bookmark it. This is the library here, excabo.blazor.script injection. But again, that's for another discussion because we're not going to cover packaging these up into DLLs yet. It's a bit advanced for a beginnerish session, if you like. But it's all doable, is what I'm trying to say here. So you can see what we've done here. We've got our styles. We've got a nice chunk of HTML here. And you'll notice that we've got just one simple variable. And that has yet another attribute on called parameter. Anything that you have as a variable that is marked as parameter is expected to be passed in from the parent that uses that control. So if we go back to our user list, you'll see that this is a lot different to the table one that we had before. Now, all I'm simply doing is looping over the list of users that comes in from my user service, but now it's a single user entry tag, and I have this user data parameter here, which takes @user, the user coming from there, from the loop, and passes it into that particular component. That user data, the name must match here, and I'm not sure, but I think it does have to start with a capital letter. Actually, that's something that I forgot to mention. When you're defining components, by the way, they must start with a capital letter. Because the creation of the class that sits behind the component, and for that matter the page as well, is done in the compiler, and it generates all this boilerplate for you, there is a convention that page roots and component objects and types all follow, it's not camel case, it's Pascal case, I believe. Feel free to correct me, anybody, in chat if you want to. But the Pascal case, the uppercase initial letter, is obviously Microsoft and largely most of the programmers that I know's preferred style. So with Blazor, it's been enforced on you to use that style, unfortunately. If you try to create a component and make the initial letter a small case letter, you will get a build error. And that caught me out quite a few times the first time round because I wasn't expecting it and I couldn't really make sense of it. So if you're new to this Blazor stuff and you're just experimenting with it, do need to watch out for that. If you get a strange error to do with naming that you don't understand, or your components are just not appearing as purple tags or not being able to be used in your UI layouts, then check you haven't used a lowercase letter for the name of it. Renaming them fixes it. Generally you will get a compiler and a build error as well, so you'll know if you've done something daft, so to speak. But yeah, that's largely it. If you want to add parameters to your components, then they are defined with a parameter. What you need to be careful of with using parameters is that they must be public or they must be protected. If I change this to private, for example, give it a second, you'll see that it goes red squiggly. And it goes red squiggly because private, as we all know, is private to that particular class, not to the inherited classes, not to any classes that it may inherit from, so on and so forth. You can use protected, I believe. Maybe you can't. That hasn't gone away yet. Nope. I was under the impression that you could. So no, it does actually have to be public. Anything other than public, and that will cause a build error too. So if you're setting up parameters, and again you're getting build errors that you don't understand, check that your parameters are public too. This is all stuff that basically I've learned messing about with Blazor. I don't think there's really anything else there that I need to cover. Suffice to say, if we just quickly run that, and you can see and it's put it down there again. Clever Windows. And you can see, there we go. So each of these here within the black box is an instance of our nested component, nested inside the user list, nested inside the page, nested inside the layout. Yep. All good stuff. You can see that that was a very rich looking list as well. So going back to what I said just a little while ago about WPF allowing you to have this ultimate creativity to build your user objects up in any way that you want and use any styles or layout that you like, we've just done it there. Now, we have Bootstrap built into this. I'm not using any of the Bootstrap stuff, but you can imagine, if you will, using the Bootstrap media control and the Bootstrap rows and columns layouts to neatly lay all this stuff out. And you've got a very, very, very rich UI design for doing these kinds of layouts. And that's largely where Microsoft are going with Blazor. I think one of the things that they're angling Blazor at as well is replacement of desktop apps. Old WinForms apps, for example. It's ridiculously easy now to take something like this, especially if you're using the WebAssembly client, and wrap it up in Electron. Those of you who watch the Microsoft news and read the Microsoft blogs will know that they are working on an accompaniment to this called WebWindow. WebWindow is designed mostly to take a Blazor application and turn it into a desktop application. And not just a desktop application that runs on Windows, but a desktop application that will run on Macintosh, will run on Linux, and everywhere that .NET Core will run in general as well. Right, moving on. I can't see any questions or anything in any of the chat, and Derek, I'm assuming, is still there. Hasn't pinged me. I think there's a 3 or 4 second delay between what I'm saying here and what's appearing. So you might be a little bit in front of me. No questions yet. Yep, you guys are a little bit in front of me. I'm about 4 or 5 seconds behind you by the looks of it. Goodo. Have we got a lot of users there, Derek? There's quite a few people actually in the chat, or have we not got many at all? $11 watching. Well, hello to all 11 of you. I hope you're enjoying my rambling on like a gibbering idiot, because believe it or not, this is my superhero skill. I am a gibbering idiot that pretends to know technology. Right, moving on then. So, most of you will no doubt be chomping at the bit and saying right now, okay, we get the idea, layout, compostable components, yada yada yada. How do we make it do interactive stuff like clicking on buttons? So we'll skip forward to the next step. And if I open up my user entry component now, we'll just collapse the styles for a moment. And we'll go down here a little bit. You will see that I've added an extra div in. And this, quite simply, has an @onClick in and the name of a function. And you'll see down here, I have a function called clickHandler. It's all very, very simple. The @on parts are just the same as their JavaScript counterparts. So where you would use onClick in JavaScript, onChange, onBlur, onFocus, all of that lot are all implemented. It's all lowercase for the attribute where Blazor is concerned, and it's preceded by an @ And you can see that we've put a small amount of code in there with an @ message in, and just like normal Razor syntax, as you would expect from Razor pages, that will put that data into there. So if we run this, and it opened it up there. I was waiting for it down on the lower screen, and you'll see we've got our button, and if I click my button, I've had my button clicked, I've had my button clicked, I've had my button clicked, and Pink Panther's had his button clicked. Yep. All, again, straightforward. If you've done any kind of JavaScript coding, none of this should be particularly alien to any of you. For the naysayers that are still chuntering on about Microsoft abandoning this when they get bored of it, and about wanting Silverlight to come back, this is all web standards. So even if Microsoft do get bored of it, the community is still going to run with this. This is a UI framework that is just to be loved, essentially, and you get to work in C#, so everybody wins. Now, some of you out there might be thinking to yourselves, right, okay, onClick makes sense. I see how to click buttons and things. But what happens if I need to pass some information to my handler? Well, that's quite easy too. Step forward another one. And go back to this, and you will see now that I've wrapped my onClick with an @ because it's now Razor syntax into a lambda. The E will always be the event type. So this bit here, I mean, obviously, like any normal .NET lambda, you can call this variable anything you like, but that will always be the type of event that's been triggered. So if you wish, for example, you'll see that that one's a mouse event args. At that point there, I could get the .x out of it, the .y out of it to pass the position of the mouse pointer in. I can pass in which button was clicked. Anything that's available on a regular mouse event in JavaScript is available in the C# object counter, if you like. Facsimile, I don't know, words are not coming in my brain. And the same is true for anything. So if you've got an onFocus, an onBlur, or even an onDrag and drop, for those who are doing drag and drop components, you will have an E that will be a drag and drop event args, it will be a focus event args, it will be a select event args, and there's a number of them. They're all listed in plain English in the Blazor documentation that I showed you just before there when we were on about nested layouts. And we call our click handler in the normal way, as though it was a normal function in normal C# code, and we pass our things in by parameter, and you can see that we've simply just changed the method signature so that those parameters are passed into it as well. And again, if we run this, and blimey, it's 20 past 8 already, or nearly 20 past 8. You will see that you click 1, click 2, click 3, click 4, because that's the ID that each of these have. So that user record has an ID of 1, ID of 2. We're passing in that particular piece of data from the data that's in that instance of the component. Specifically, the data that's in here in this user data object that was passed in from our parent. Now, at this point, you might be saying, well, okay, that's great. That's how we do buttons. That's how we click on things. That's how we pass information within this component. But, shorty, you've got a small component there that's part of a bigger loop. And I would like to pass that data out to this component and have that know which of the child components were clicked, for example. Okay then? Well, that's just as easy to do. So we'll go ahead to the next revision. And if we now go to our user entry, you will see that the callback routine I had has been replaced by an event callback. And that event callback has an int. Okay? Now, at this point, you can, if you wish, just have a standard on click. Right? If I didn't, for example, want to provide any data to this click handler, I could simply just say on click equals click handler and have that event callback click handler just like that. Right? But because I'm passing data to it, and because I want that data to be passed down to the parent component, I have to use Invoke Async. Right? So simply just by using the same call semantics that I did before, but putting .invoke async between the method call and the bracketed part, and then changing my handler function to a parameter. Remember, parameters have to be public. Parameters are specified in the parent on the child component when you compose it. I can then pass that across. You can pass multiple, I believe anyway, but I can't for the hell of me remember what the syntax is for it there. I don't know whether you pass it as a dictionary or whether it's int comma int. I suspect you probably would be able to make very good use of tuples here as well. If anybody watched the .NET Core 3.1 session that's also available on YouTube that I did for Hinton just before all this COVID-19 madness started, you will see that there's a section in that dealing with how to use the new tuple type in .NET 3.1. It's worth a watch because they are probably relevant for passing multiple data across. For now though, we'll just stick with passing a simple single integer across. So if we go back to our user list and we look in here, you will see now that as well as the user data, yep, 20 past warning. I've got that because my phone is about to start. So let me just turn that off. There we go. Before it starts making lots of noise and the microphone picks it up. Right, so the user data, you'll see, is now alongside this click handler parameter, and this click handler parameter merely just points at a setClicked function exactly the same way as we had with the individual function in the individual component, and that has a simple int ID on it, and that selected ID is then picked up by the parent component. If we run this, and get our nice list up with the photographs and that in, you'll now see that just below here we have a selected user ID, which is currently at 0. And if I click one of these, you will see it's that ID that changes. That is part of the user list component, whereas these are still individual user entry components. And again, as before, that's our user list, that's a user entry, this is our this is our page, this is our layout, and the browser is our application. And that's basically all we've got code-wise. I've got a couple more slides here. I'm just going to quickly spend the last couple of minutes running through. So let's just skip over that. Right. Server-side gotchas. So, I don't think I need to say this one. The most obvious one is that you're running on the server. The programming model is by design intended to look the same, and if you have server and WASM clients in the same projects, it's probably going to be very easy to get confused. The interop for working with JavaScript is available server-side, but there are a few differences to what you can and cannot do and how you use it. I don't have time to bring up Chris's, or do I? Let's have a look. Yeah, I've got a minute or two. When I find my mouse pointer, there it is. If you want to dig into using the JavaScript interop, then this is the post that you need. Go to chrissainty.com. This guy is a Blazor wizard, basically. He knows far more about Blazor than I ever will. He generally hangs around in the Gitter Blazor room as well with the rest of us, so he's usually there to answer a few questions. But serious folks, just this page itself, just this single blog post tells you everything you need to know about using JavaScript, not just in the WebAssembly client, but in the server side as well. And it gives a few different warnings and things as well that you need to pay attention to. Your services are also server-side. So if you're building a server-side application, you may be tempted to use your services in the same way that I've demonstrated using the services in this project tonight, by just calling directly into the code. That obviously is not going to work as expected in the browser version. If you're running this in WebAssembly and you try to call a service, it's going to look for it in the context of the C# code running in the browser itself. That said, you can still use HTTP client. So there's nothing stopping you from loading up a standard C# HTTP client and making normal REST calls in exactly the same way as you might from any C# app where you call out to a web API or any other kind of API. And the advantage is that when you do eventually decide to go to WebAssembly, you have to make very, very small changes to make your server-side application a client application. In fact, if memory serves me right, it's 3 or 4 lines. Yeah. So good practices like using HTTP client, even in a server-side, really are the best place to be. Cookies. Yeah. It's a server-side app, folks. Yes, you do have a web browser portion. Yes, you do have an index HTML, but you cannot access the cookies and things the way you think you can. Now, I'm not going to be able to show you my DSNetOps application because I need to switch back to Derek from NeBytes shortly to do the wrap-up. But if you want to ping me on Twitter, I'll quite happily explain But in order to do cookie-based auth with a Blazor server-side application, what you basically need to do is you need to add a couple of standard Blazor pages, and then you have to have your login form and the calls to your login authentication services on those pages in standard Blazor page format. Then switch back to the Razor pages, then switch back to the Blazor application from there. What I will probably do is the application that I've got up and on my GitHub that I used for the demo for this, I will actually add some Razor pages into that, showing you how to set cookies and how to work with the auth services. I may do that tonight, I may do that sort of over the weekend, depends on what time I've got. Once the cookies are there, and once the browser can see them, then the authentication system can use them. It really is that simple. But you can't set and reset them and do clever things with them the way you might expect. The way you might expect with standard ASP.NET MVC. And that's largely a wrap. Sorry I didn't have time to show the other application. I'm going to get Derek to dial back in just a second. Let me just get rid of that slide. And if you ring now, Derek, I'll put you back on the screen. Yep. Oh, there we go. And yeah, you can't hear mine. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter, for that. That's fabulous demonstration there. And the demo gods were smiling.
Yeah, more or less. I don't know if you can actually hear me speaking, by the way.
Thanks very much for doing that. Probably can't hear applause.
Well,
Thanks everyone for
hold on.
this very first one.
Right, hold on.
We're going to be doing some more
Do you want
in this
to
coming month,
repeat that?
and so keep an eye out on Tito.
I had
Keep an eye out on Twitter,
muted.
and keep an eye out on the emails as well, because we'll be sending out events as they get finalized and come along. We actually have our own YouTube channel now as well, so we'll be putting stuff up on there as well. Okay, so keep an eye out for that. I'll send out links on Twitter and stuff like that.
I don't know if you can hear
again,
this, but I screwed
thank you very
up on
much
the first 30 seconds.
to Shorty for coming along and doing this, being our guinea pig for our first presentation live on YouTube. And keep an eye out for events coming up, and we'll see you all again next time.
Yeah,
good night.
Absolutely. Good night all, hopefully. I don't know if my audio's mixed with this.